virtual event of a looming threat to the nascent US electric vehicle industry. But we're taking a particular slice of that, an angle that doesn't cover the entire issue of the emerging industry, but the issue of the material component of electric batteries and how the US and the West is not really in control over the next decade or so of the supply chain for that. And we have two wonderful speakers and moderator in Steve Levine and Liam Denning. Steve, who is an expert on this particular subject, and Liam, who is an expert in energy in general. Steve has written many books, editorials, was the lead editorialist for the New York Times editorial about 3-4 months ago on this subject. And Liam is with the Bloomberg News Service and is their energy journalist. Before we get started, and we'll get started in just a minute, I want to just briefly announce several upcoming meetings, all virtual, but one in April and one in person in May. Upcoming tomorrow, we have an event that we didn't do ourselves, but is featuring an MIT Sloan professor, Professor Donald Saul. It's the MIT Club of France that is putting this event on strategy. It's 2 p.m. If you're a Sloan alum in the New York area, you can look for your email. On the 21st, we have an event on how to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world with Dory Clark. That's 6 to 7 p.m. On the 28th of March, we have an event on the sustainable global economy and market with the CEO of Barclays, CS Venkat for short. On April 6th, we have another event on leadership, this about resilient leadership with Brian Featherstone-Bach, and he is the former Chief People Officer of Ogilvy Mather, and Lori Rosenfield, who is the Chief People Officer of Hill & Knowlton, would be doing the fireside chat Q&A portion. And then on April 12th, we have an event on quantum computing. On April 14th, in person, Professor Lowe and other eminent MIT Sloan professors and others will be here in New York in the evening to discuss In Pursuit of the Perfect Portfolio. And that is for Sloan alum only. And then upcoming April 27th, we have an event on space innovation. And in May, in person, on May 18th is the first annual Women's Founders event and pitch. So we've got a pretty full schedule coming up. And Liam, if I can turn the event over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Apologies for the lighting here that makes me look like I'm in some sort of witness protection program or something. We are very honored today to have Steve Levine with us. I could list all of Steve's various credentials. Just to name a few, he's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. When I first met him, which I think is more than a decade ago now, we mainly talked about the oil business. He's written for really the most credentialed publications around, everything from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post. But today he's the editor of what I think is one of the most exciting new publications, The Electric, which covers all things batteries and EVs for the information. Before I hand over to Steve, just to set a little context on what we're talking about here. If you go back to the year that the US was most dependent on oil from OPEC, it's 1977, and OPEC supplied about 1/3 of US oil demand that year. and the psychological scars of that time are still with us. If you look at today's battery industry, China controls somewhere between 60 and 80% of things like battery cells, battery cathodes, lithium processing capacity. So that's the context of the struggle that Steve has chronicled, and he's going to talk about today. So without further ado, Steve.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks for that introduction. And Larry, thanks so much for inviting me today. I'm really excited to speak to the MIT alumni. So this topic, the one we're talking about today, it is one of the most important commercial and economic topics that we have right now, and that's a main reason why I like to appear before groups and talk about it. Just to tee it up, I'm going to Liam and I are going to chat for about 30 minutes, but I want to tee that up. So how did we get to this place? So 5 years ago, people must be aware, Tesla opened up its first gigafactory, its first large battery making factory in Nevada, and it had the capacity from the outset to make 35 gigawatt hours of batteries per year, and it was a big bet by Tesla, by Elon Musk, to produce batteries for its Model S and then for the Model 3. But in the industry, in the battery industry, in the EV industry, it was seen at best at the most courteous as a novelty, and no one went along with Tesla on this ride to establish a battery footprint. Except on the other side of the earth, the Chinese were doing pretty much the same thing. Remember that the idea of batteries and EVs being a substantial new thing began during the Obama administration, about 2009, 2010. Everyone started around the world, the United States, Europe, and China began all at the same time with the same idea of putting down feet and establishing themselves a strategic place, a commercial place in these new, what we're seeing as new industries. Over that decade, though, the teens, only the Chinese and only Elon Musk stuck with it. The US walked away from it, and so did Europe. Well, about 2 years ago, American automakers, European automakers, Korean battery makers woke up and saw, hey, this is happening. The new EV age is actually happening, and we run the risk of being the next Kodak or Nokia, meaning being driven into oblivion by missing a paradigmic commercial shift. And so today in the United States, there are 13 gigafactories, not including Tesla's new gigafactory that's going to open up later this year in Austin. 13 new gigafactories, 4 of them announced by GM, three of them announced by Ford, and so on. GM has announced it plans to be selling 1 million EVs by 2025. Ford says it's going to be selling 2 million EVs by 2025, and so does VW and Toyota. All say the same thing. What none of them has made clear is where are they getting the metals, the refined nickel, manganese, cobalt, graphite, and lithium that are required for those batteries. All of that capacity of producing the refined versions of those metals are in China. And so basically the Western champions are asking China to supply them to produce vehicles to beat it in one of the most important technological races of our times. The Biden administration and Congress over the last several months have made clear that they understand the importance of the strategic, the economic, and commercial importance of these new trillion-dollar industries that will go for trillions of dollars per year over decades, and have now $7.5 billion. This is the U.S. ante into these industries. It's something. It's not a lot, but it's where we're starting. And I just wanted to drop two more thoughts before going into the talk with Liam. One is that because of where we are and how long it takes to set up the supply of the metals and then the factories to refine them, what we're really talking about is making investments now for the 2030s. The sad state of affairs is that we have lost the 2020s. That's over. So we're talking about the 2030s. And finally, just to underscore the precarity of the situation, the war in Ukraine and the run up of oil prices. Norilsk Nickel, the Russian nickel company, makes 20% of battery grade nickel for the world, nickel being the primary metal in a cathode, the cathode being the main part of the battery. As of now, that supply is uncertain. An atmosphere of uncertainty, of distrust, has been created by that and by a big short. I'm sure everyone has heard of Big Shot, the Chinese nickel producer made a enormous bet shorting nickel, and that caused the price to go up sixfold over a 2-day period. It just means it underscores how important it is for the United States and for Europe too, but for the United States to take charge of their own battery supply chain.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for those comments. So just to let everybody know, this is going to kind of shake down in 2 rounds. There's going to be 30 or 40 minutes of dialogue between Steve and myself, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So Steve, you wrote this op-ed in the New York Times in December, and I remember you writing that the US was little more than a spectator of what's going on in global batteries. Now, from my perspective, I've been inundated with news about Tesla for the past decade, and that inundation only seems to gather pace as time goes on. And so I look at this and I see this US company that is worth more than the entire rest of the global autos industry put together. Its founder is hailed as a new Thomas Edison. I see even General Motors and Ford, companies we tend to think of as dinosaurs, making significant commitments, at least in terms of what they're going to invest. So that seems paradoxical. It seems to me the US has the #1 EV brand in the world. It has incumbent manufacturers that are putting their weight behind this. So why do you seem so pessimistic about it? Yeah,
That's a good question. It is true that that is an omission in the Tesla omission in that piece. We have the instigator, the trigger of this whole age in the United States. That's true, and on many levels, he is establishing his own battery supply chain in the United States, in Texas. The other automobile companies are announcing EVs that are coming and gigafactories that are coming. They're not announcing the metals supply chain. It's what you have, and a very good source of mine put it this way, that you're going to end up, with the exception of Tesla, with like 400 or 500 gigawatt hours, 13 gigafactories producing battery cells, empty battery cells. Basically, gigafactories not able to produce any batteries because of the lack of foresight in producing the value chain. And Tesla too, right? Tesla has been the best of all of them. It's still scrambling. It's not going to have enough cathode powder. And just to underscore that, because of this uncertainty around nickel, and because of the run up in prices in the other metals that go into the standard cathode, there's a shift underway, a very smart shift to a different kind of cathode that's based on iron. It's called the LFP cathode. And iron, as we know, is everywhere, right? So it's not going to end up in short supply. Even if the price goes up, we're still going to have iron. It will not surprise you that close to 100% of the LFP supply is produced by China. And so again, so Tesla has announced, Musk has announced, up to half of the cars that I make, of the EVs I make, will use LFP. He does not have an LFP factory. Where is that going to come from? So it's one thing announcing you're going to make cars. It's another thing that you're going to announce a gigafactory. You're going to make your own cells. These are shiny objects, right? The strategic center, the strategic anchor of the industry, of who's going to win, is owning the supply chain, and that's from the ore all the way across to processing to producing that powder that goes into the cells. And that's where we fall down, and so does Europe.
I mean, that's a fascinating line to go down, because if you think about the incumbent automakers, when you talk about that kind of vertical integration back up to the mine, I mean, we're sort of getting into the territory of Henry Ford and Fordlandia in Brazil in the 1930s, when he was trying to secure rubber supplies. Is that really the way the industry has to go? Do we need to see kind of Fordlandia too, with Ford or GM literally owning stakes in lithium deposits and that sort of thing?
Well, so maybe I think that if you are going minimum viable product, you can leave the mining to the mining companies. You can contract out to them for the supplies, but you do have to secure everything from the mine to the creation of the cathode active materials that go into the cells. And it's this supply. It's not just that it's China, and it's not just the geopolitical competition we're in, but our history with OPEC tells us we don't want to rely on a single source of supply for a central commodity that's a central economic feature for us. The second reason is this stuff is heavy, right? And so it's not like shipping silicon chips. This is and so we lose competitiveness if the cathode powders, if the graphite for the anodes are processed and made elsewhere and shipped here. And so there really does need to be a local supply chain. The automakers and the battery makers have to take charge of that.
And this raises questions of reshoring and reestablishing U.S. industrial capacity, and these are all questions that are becoming were already becoming more talked about, but particularly now that we've seen the invasion in Ukraine and sanctions being imposed, they've taken on a new urgency. But I guess where I have difficulty with this is it sort of runs into the inherent messiness of US capitalism, right? It runs into the fact that generally, by and large, we don't expect auto companies to go out and invest in mines or even provide financing to mines. They just sort of do their thing, and we expect everything to show up. And those are the just-in-time manufacturing chains that we've built. And certainly looking at, for example, what's happened with President Biden's kind of green-tinged infrastructure and industry policy over the past year and how it's stalled out. I question, can we, as a country, even do this, or do our natural instincts and political divisions prevent it?
Yeah. So we used to be able to do it, right? So we had Henry Ford was one guy. There were hundreds of automobile companies in the teens and in the 1920s in the United States and in Europe, all of them competing against one another. In the latter couple of decades, the latter 3 decades of the 19th century, there are the robber barons, Rockefeller and the Mellons and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and so on. So we do have history. We have now one guy. We have Elon Musk. What has happened? I ask every time. So I do a monthly live chat with someone big in the industry, either the battery industry or the car industry, and I ask every time. I ask the question, what's wrong with us? Have we lost? Have Americans lost their vision? Have we lost our nerve, our guts? But we're waiting. The Chinese and Elon Musk saw future demand. They saw a future industry and decided they were going to put down all of their chips and own those industries. And they were right. To this day, the other automakers in Europe, in the United States, are waiting for demand, right? So again, with the shiny objects, that's the gigafactories. Those are the vehicles. They are putting down bets. But with these, the strategic anchor, right? The processing, no one wants to get their hands dirty. It's kind of an extension of our education system, right? Where everyone wants to go onto Wall Street or be a lawyer. No one wants to start up a manufacturing concern. It's the same thing. Silicon Valley, what they're investing in. Do you have Silicon Valley companies investing in manganese mines or refining companies? No. And but we need to. You asked the question. Do we still have that in us? I think we have to. We have to recover that.
I think this raises an interesting point around incentives, right? Because thinking about electric vehicles in the context of clean tech overall, the big thing we lack in the US is a transparent incentive. If you had a price on the thing you're trying to get rid of, which is carbon emissions, then people might be more incentivized to invest in these in these value chains. But what that raises for me is, in the absence of that, can any of this be done without some form of industrial policy? Thinking back to last year, Bloomberg NEF did a joint study with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And one of their conclusions was, part of China's success in this is that they implemented incentives to suppliers and on the demand side at the same time. And it seems to me that if you don't have transparent price signals, that seems to be the sine qua non of actually getting any of this done. And yet, here we are in a 50-50 Senate, and federal policy at least seems to be stalled out. Is there an alternative path?
Yeah, and we've just had Joe Manchin. It was either today or was yesterday.
It was yesterday.
Yeah. It was yesterday, yeah, at Dan Yergin's conference, announcing he's opposed to incentives for electric vehicles. But look at the reason, right? The reason he opposes is because China controls the supply chain. Right? We need the supply chain. So he needs to be he's misinformed. He needs to to, instead of opposing the supply chain, support the building of the supply chain. I do think you're right, Liam, that there needs to be wise industrial policy that incentivizes. It's so important that it does need to economically incentivize these actors to move. But I do think that there's something wrong when so I'm just reading about, in fact, it was on Bloomberg, about the Rivian factory, opposition to the Rivian factory going up in Georgia. And so Rivian has gotten a slew, more than $100 million of tax and other incentives to build one of its production facilities in Georgia, and there's aggravation in certain quarters in Georgia about that. But I looked at it, and it includes that the government taxes are going to pay to train Rivian workers. Well, wow. You mentioned Henry Ford. Henry Ford had two separate universities at Ford in Michigan to train workers to be auto workers, to earn. He was paying more than anyone. He established the $5 day. Then when the Depression hit, he established the $7 day, right? Putting money into people's pockets. And he trained thousands of workers, not just for himself, but for the industry. And the companies have become too accustomed to relying on government signals and clues and money to make their decisions, to train their workers. So yes, industrial policy, but our companies need to take a hard look at themselves against Elon Musk.
Related to that, another thing that occurs to me about the state of the US value chain is that, if I think about the most obvious example of successful reshoring in the US recently, it's actually the oil and gas business, right? It's the fact that domestic US oil and gas production has skyrocketed since 2008. Now, part of that was we just had this concentration of latent capacity sitting in Texas, waiting to be used. I struggle to see that in the battery chain. Do those centers exist in the US? Is there some pool of talent concentrated in some other city that isn't Houston? What do you think about that?
Well, look at that. There is something latent in oil guys going back to Rockefeller and all the way that makes them just sort of lose their minds, right? It's gold fever. And that, that's what the shale gas and the shale oil booms were. And were those, is that industrial policy? Maybe there was some of that, maybe depreciation. You'll probably know the answer to that. A lot of it was the profit motive. But no, so I see SPAC mania, but that's a Wall Street thing. And I'm not seeing the same kind of passion, animal spirits around batteries, again, unless it's with those the shiny object part that doesn't involve getting dirt under your fingernails.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I just want to say we're getting a lot of questions, so we're going to extend the session to 1:15. So not 1 o'clock as was previously communicated. So just to switch gears, you mentioned Shangwang Da, or Big Shot, as I can scarcely believe he's actually called, but there it is. It's like something a fiction writer came up with.
Yeah.
So tomorrow, the London Metal Exchange is actually going to reopen cautious trade in nickel after last week's spike forced them to shut it down. I mean, we, meaning the general public, we're used to seeing big gyrations in the oil market. The metals markets have their fair share of controversies, but they tend to fly under the radar for most people. So I'm just interested to know what you other than it being a good story, what do you take to be the implications of, Big Shot getting into big trouble on his big short?
That's so great. Elmore Leonard wrote this script.
That's right.
So that whole run up happened in 18 minutes.
Yes.
It's pretty crazy, speaking of animal spirit. So, Shang, he comes from humble beginnings, rags to riches story. He made car doors, car window frames, and then just sort of that's in the 1980s, and then over time got the stainless steel bug and built himself. He is the world's largest producer of nickel. He is the largest producer of stainless steel. He went into Indonesia 10 years ago before anyone knew what was going to happen there. Now Indonesia is the largest producer of nickel on the planet. He's building a lot of that capacity, and no one is sure was his big short because he anticipated a collapse in prices, or was he hedging that big bet that he's making in Indonesia? And the war in Ukraine, right? Everyone should remember, right? The war in Chechnya lasted 10 years, right? Ukraine is not going away. All of these commercial players that have left Russia isn't going to simply allow them back, right? It's right. So this instability that we're seeing right now, and the reverberations are going to last for some time, right? For some years. So the message that I get from the Big Short, from Big Shot's Big Short, and from the Norilsk Nichols supply, the uncertainty being created about that is that the supply chain, sort of the smug confidence, and I don't use that lightly. There is this confidence that everything is going to be cool, right? That commodities go through their cycles. That when there's the price incentive, the industry will answer. There will be supplies. Yeah. But can you forecast the invasion of Ukraine, right? and so this is uncertain ground. You cannot trust the supply. Maybe it's generally reliable, although we don't even know that for sure. And so it means that we need to bet the car makers, the battery makers need to bet on more reliable supplies. They need to bet on a worst case scenario. Like I'm arguing that they need to double and triple down on LFP. Iron and phosphate is everywhere, right? And so it means that fewer of us are going to have 500 and 600 miles of range, but 300 miles is a lot, right? And so that's enough. It's not drinking castor oil. 300 miles is a lot of range.
You know, just on that, one thing that has occurred to me about the LFP technology is that in some ways it puts even more of an onus on us to come up with a useful strategy on charging, right? Because one of the solutions, if the problem is building ever greater quantities of large batteries, then one of the solutions is making sure you don't need those batteries, right? And perhaps you could talk it's slightly tangential, but what are your views on that other side of all this, which is enabling the consumer to embrace these technologies, one of which is charging. Again, that seems a very straightforward thing in some ways, and yet politically controversial in the US.
Yeah. So it's a central feature that has to happen. The reason that I haven't focused on it in the same way that I focused on the metals is that I have the impression that the industry understands and it's doing it. And what is it doing? It is in the United States and in Europe establishing ubiquity of charging, and because that's what has to happen to be comfortable, buying an electric car, shifting from an ICE vehicle, a combustion vehicle, to an electric car. You have to have in your mind, it's sort of a mental state. You have to just subliminally know that if you're out of gas, you don't need to worry about it, or if you're out of charge, right? That there's a charging station on the corner, and there's going to be a space empty, and you're going to be able to charge fast. So it has to be ubiquity, and it has to be fast charge. And what does fast charge mean? It's not that you're going to be able to go in like you do with gasoline and in 3 to 5 minutes be in and out. It's like the goal in my view is 15 minutes. I think 15 minutes is a really good amount of time. It's not too much, and it can be technologically reach. You'll just sit around. People love to sit around looking at their phones, right? You'll plug in your thing. In 15 minutes, you'll get 200 miles of range, and you'll check your emails. This is happening. It's in motion. It's a fast charge is an industry all to itself. It's not just one thing. There are 5 or 6 different businesses that make up fast charge. Stretching from grid all the way to having it in your battery, right? The capacity of the battery. So it's going to make a lot of money. The folks who understand this and get into one of the businesses that's one of the profit nerve centers.
Yes, I completely agree. I like the way you describe it. Pumping gas is something you do, and charging your car is something that happens while you do something else. Is kind of how I tend to think about it. Can we? I'm going to park Ukraine just for a second. It's obviously a huge topic, but just to go back on what you were saying about cyclicality and the sort of the smug assumption that everything will turn out fine. I mean, just to play devil's advocate, which is sort of 90% of my job description, but I've seen 3 oil boom and bust just in the last 15 years, and every time there's always the panic-stricken talk of peak this or peak that, and in general, you know, supply and demand balance, supply is found. I know prior to Ukraine, there was some panic creeping into the conversation about lithium, that we were going to face a real shortage in the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, haven't we just seen all this before, or is this supply chain just a fundamentally different beast from your perspective?
Yeah, so I side with you on the history of oil panic, right? The price goes up, the explorers go out, they find more oil, and suddenly we're not peak oil anymore.
And we use less. And
right.
We also use less, right?
Yeah, and the CAFE standards go up, and efficiency is greater. There are a couple of differences. One is oil is one commodity and it's fungible, right? The Ludwig Nobel's invention of the oil tanker, you know, really made what you're describing possible, right? And so that's one thing. The second thing is there are 5 metals to worry about, right? In the standard as we know it today, battery, the NMC, the cathode, and the graphite anode, and so there will be enough in a few years. There will be enough nickel. There's a shortage of lithium now, but in 2025 there might not be. But you know, what about cobalt, and you know, what about manganese, and so you know, the way this is going to go is you know, there will be enough of some, there won't be enough of another, and you know, it's sort of like VW's nightmare now. It can't make any cars because it doesn't have wire harnesses, right? The wire harnesses are made in Ukraine, and there's a wire harness guy I know here in the United States. Can't you give VW your wire harnesses? Their validation process takes so long that he will not be able to supply. He cannot fill this for like this gap for 3 or 4 years. So yeah, I do think it's different as it stands now, but it can be, right, the you know, LFP, and then there's another battery, the sodium ion battery. That's another kind that doesn't involve lithium at all. Its range is much lower, so this, you know, that's a real downside. But I'm just saying that there are alternatives, and those will come into use, and we will, right? We will get this under control over years. This decade is going to be a bumpy decade. It already is a bumpy decade, and it's a lost decade. Right? We're relying on our primary technological rival to supply us.
Right, that makes sense. I'd just like to highlight to everyone that Steve Levine has a wire harness guy, in case you need anything on that front. So Ukraine, you know, talking of bumpy decades, we've already racked up a pandemic and now a major invasion in Europe, and we're only in 2022. The thing that really leaps out to me about Ukraine, and particularly the economic retaliation by the West, is that this strikes me as fundamentally different from what we have known before in terms of how energy markets in general have operated. You know, we're already seeing some of the implications with the nickel price. We've seen Tesla just whacked up the prices of all its models by $2,000 to $5,000, a piece to deal with it. What this comes back to for me is, globalization has been the great friend of energy, right? It's allowed us to diversify. It's allowed us to keep costs to a minimum, to deal with shortages by sourcing from somewhere else. We're potentially moving into a world where we're not just managing the occasional disruption, but markets are actually fragmenting. We're at a point where you may simply not be able to source from this or that place, or if you do, it'll have to go through 18 potentially illegal steps in order to do so. Can the battery revolution take off in that kind of environment? Because in some ways, you look at high oil prices and you say, that's great for electrification, increases their attractiveness, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, we're still building these chains. We clearly don't want to be dependent on one power, particularly when that power, Saudi Arabia, at least for much of the post-war period, was a nominal ally of the US. China is clearly an adversary. So can this actually happen in that environment?
Yeah. This is a really good question. So this decade, for the reasons you state, there aren't going to be enough EVs to meet demand. So automakers will sell every single EV they can make, and the struggle will be, can you cobble together, if you're Volkswagen, if you're Toyota, how many vehicles can you cobble together given the shortages of wire harnesses and semiconductors and these battery metals and sensors and so on. I made attempts to add this up, and it's somewhere between a shortage of 15 to 35 million EVs will be unable to be made this decade, right? But because as it stands now, right? I mean,
sorry, and Steve, just to put that in context for everyone, 15 to 35 million vehicles is the equivalent of something like, 20 to 40% of annual demand for all kinds of vehicles.
Right.
Huge number.
Yeah, and so I think the industry is going to respond. Like, as I say, I think there's going to be this shift to LFP, they'll figure this out, right? So they are figuring out what you've just described, that the world is fragmenting. But Liam, so you do have the division of the world initially into these two zones, right? The Chinese and the American-led zone. But now we're seeing a greater fragmentation. We're seeing a great divide, right? An economic, a geopolitical divide going up. This whole age, this last 30 years, was predicated on globalization, and part of that was the ubiquity of the internet, right? And this is how we're going to project. It's the projection of commerce, right? What is Amazon, right? And what over-the-air updates by Tesla, and so on. But China and now Russia have cut off their internets from the rest of the world. We're losing globalization on the sea and on land and so on, and we're losing it in the Ethernet, or however in the ether, and it underscores. I mean, in the EV space and the battery space, it underscores why the chain needs to be localized. And by localized, it doesn't all have to be in the US. It can be this hemisphere. It should be this hemisphere, North and South America. And incidentally, who's building our battery factories? South Korea. South Korea is in effect part in this chain is part of North America and South America. Northvolt, right? Northvolt is like is the Tesla of Europe in terms of making batteries. Who are its co-CEOs? Tesla veterans, right? Again, Tesla. But they have built up their capacity using brain power from Japan. Right? This is brought over, imported a bunch of talent from there. So yes. So the answer is yes. I think that this can be overcome. We do have a divide. It does mean like battling cantons, right? Big cantons, and a very different. Like we're entering a new age, and it is characterized by what you described.
And it'll be a more expensive age, correct?
Yeah.
As in, you don't localize without driving up the cost of it.
Yes. Yes. So we've got competing dynamics right now. Oil prices going through the roof, which should incentivize demand for EVs, but we've got supply chain problems, which is driving up the price of EVs. And so, I did look at Tesla's price increase of the last week, 2 price increases in 1 week. And the Model Y, the crossover, that's its most popular vehicle by far, starts at $64,000.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm going to cover just one more topic with Steve, and then I'll open it to questions. Steve, in the background over the last couple of years, and an important tailwind to all this has been the acceleration in ESG directed capital, environmental, social, governance related investment. Clearly, the battery industry does very well on the E, the environmental bit of that, because of what it's trying to tackle. It's running into problems on the social aspect, I would guess. That ranges from everything from, the stories we've seen coming out of cobalt mining in Congo, to, frankly, the role of China, both because of human rights abuses there, but also it's the fact that China is becoming this kind of worrying aspect of the whole supply chain. Can the industry retain access to that important source of capital if these issues that in a way used to dog the oil industry start to affect this value chain?
Yeah, this actually is it's a great question, because it's maybe it's the primary competitive key. How does the West compete? It leans into ESG. So the United States reinvents how batteries are made, how metals are processed to be cleaner. You can trace the metals all the way back to the mine, and the Moroni sticker, that sticker that's on the side of every car that tells you what the CAFE standards are, will list this whole tracing of everything in the car, right? And people will just like people don't buy blood diamonds, right? They will want to know where everything came from, and there are companies in North America. Nano One is one. 6K is another that have reinvented how this processing of the metals happens to make it much cleaner. And Tesla, it won't surprise you, Tesla bought in 2020 one of these companies, Spring Power. It's called. Tesla is going to lead the way, the ESG way. One of my forecasts is that over the next year or so, let's say 2 years, Tesla is going to finally is going to get Giga Austin, the Gigafactory in Austin and the Gigafactory in Berlin going. They're going to be producing, the Model Y and the Cybertruck and so on. And these are going to be made using these cleaner methods. And that is going to just it's going to be a secondary shock for the other auto companies, the other battery companies. We got to do something, right? We've got to do this too, right? They're going to lose. They're going to lose if they're not producing vehicles that have green credentials.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks, Steve. I've crossed off every one of the topics I had on my list. So we're going to throw it open to questions from the audience now. I'm going to kind of group these and paraphrase them rather than go through them one by one, because there's a lot of overlap on some of the topics. Maybe just following on from what we were talking about just now, Steve. There are several questions on the issue of battery recycling and whether the components that go into batteries, can be recycled successfully, whether the metals can be recycled successfully. Because this, again, from my perspective, when I see a lot of the kind of anti-EV PR come my way, a fairly prominent theme is, these so-called touted clean technologies end up just being more landfill. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. Yes. So this is there is a very robust response going on to exactly that kind of sentiment in Europe, in the United States. In Europe, legislation law requires recycling. China, by the way, also the biggest lithium-ion recycler in the world, is owned by CATL, the big Chinese battery company. In the United States, we've got at least two big lithium-ion recyclers. Li-Cycle is one of them. It's a publicly listed company, and Redwood Materials, that's a second one. That one is the founder is JB Straubel, again a Tesla veteran, and a
very prominent one as well.
Yes, and so the idea is they say that they can recycle more than 95% of the battery. They can sell everything that's in it, and they use different processes to get there. But it's part of this. They are setting up. One of them is backed by Ford, the other one by GM, and they're setting up their processes right in the factory of those. Because when you first start making batteries, in the beginning, you're just learning. A lot of it goes to scrap, right? Defects, rejects, and you can lose half the battery in that. So all those scraps, that'll go directly into recycling. But the other thing that's not discussed is the million-mile battery. So GM has a battery called the Ultium, and it describes this battery as a million-mile battery, meaning we drive on average 13,000 miles. I mean, that battery will last 7 decades, and so that means right. So a battery is regarded as dead when it goes below 80%. So that means that it won't go below 80% for decades, right? For not the whole 7 decades, but somewhere in decades. And LFP also, the biggest makers of LFP are BYD, the Chinese company, and CATL. BYD calls its LFP battery a 750,000 mile battery. So if you're in a car and you own it, an electric car, and you own it for 10 years or 12 years, which is what people do, a lot of people do that, and it's still got 90% capacity. When you want to trade it in or move to your next vehicle, you can sell that. You can sell that vehicle right to the next person, and so like a lot of the the recycling industry has been hyped. This is where I'm leading, is that we don't need there's some recycling that we need, but what we think we need, batteries are not going to end up in landfills. We're going to have these batteries that are still going to have all this capacity. You're going to own that battery, and then and you're going to be able to sell it to someone who will take it, and I mean, you can, right? You sell that to someone else. And the other thing I wanted to add here, one of the lesser spoken about dynamics or coming dynamics in the energy industry, I'm sorry, in the EV industry is that these metals are these forecast, the shortfalls that are forecast, it makes the batteries super valuable, the metals that have already been mined, right? And so one of the competitions out there is going to be among the auto companies for who owns the battery, who gets to keep the battery when you're done with the car. So I'm talking about, and other people are talking about shifting that battery like to the grid, right? Or right when it goes under 80%, just shift it to the grid. And one of the bets that's out there, I'm still getting my arms around this, but I'll throw it out to you, and I don't know if I agree with it. But one of the is that the metals in the batteries will be so valuable when you trade in, that the GMs, the Fords of the world will recycle the battery rather than put it into another vehicle. Right? It'll still have more than 90% capacity on it, but they'll recycle it, reuse the metals, because it's more valuable than going out and looking for nickel and cobalt somewhere else.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, I could see that happening potentially. You would tend to think over time it would self-correct, but maybe not in the world we've got this decade. So another set of questions that I'll loosely group into new battery technologies. I think this is a fairly standard topic that comes up at any kind of battery conference. It's when are we going to see, solid state batteries, lithium metal batteries, etc. Rather than go through a laundry list of these, you've talked about LFP already. What are the more tangible technologies that are out there that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah. So first, LFP is not a new. This is old. Right? This is it's like buggy whips, but it's just having a resurgence. So the a couple of things that are really cool. One of them, there's a company called Our Next Energy, and in fact, I'm going to talk about it right now. But the CEO of that, Mujib Ijaz, is my guest on the next live chat, which is next week, March 22nd. He was in charge of Apple's secret EV AV program. He's also a veteran of Ford and of A123. So he's an old timer. He started this new, and he's got this really interesting technology where he sticks two cathodes and an anode, and the idea is, he says that we buy an EV where we're promised 350 miles of range, but because of the way we drive, foot on the pedal, air conditioning on, it's cold weather, actually what we get is 150 miles, and that people will want a real 300. And so his goal is building a 600 mile battery from which you'll get 300. And his the interesting thing by having two different cathodes in that battery, each of which do one of them which gives you the juice, to go fast, and the other one which gives you the range. Neither of them alone has to reach the minimum hurdle rates that the automakers are demanding before they adopt a battery. In other words, you can have inferior cathodes because you have two of them, and he is getting like a lot of attention with this, and I think that like this is really smart. So that's one guy. I'm a kind of bearish on the idea of solid state. Because yeah, so solid state, why is that a thing? Because it's safer, right? So fires, thermal runaway, that happens with electrolyte. Electrolyte is flammable, and that facilitates this whole thing with fires that start and then don't go out. And if you have a solid electrolyte, then you don't have that problem. But what is the thing that causes like what are they afraid of? They're afraid of a lithium metal anode, right? That's the thing that will cause this fire. Why do we want the lithium metal anode? Because it versus lithium ion. Lithium ion is just a few sprinkles of lithium in the graphite. Lithium metal anode is pure lithium foil, so you'll get 50% more range. Which that's a lot. Or you keep the same range and cut the price, but you need solid state with that because it's very volatile. But what you're getting is you're getting battery makers, startups that are talking about using their battery that uses solid state with silicon. Well, silicon doesn't have this flammability problem. That is a gimmick, right? So solid state has taken on this the sort of visage of the next big thing that you have to have, but it is only if you're using lithium metal, pure lithium metal, and that opens up, right? When you use, we're not there yet. The beginnings of having a lithium metal as an anode will be toward the end of this decade, and commercial scale, right? That's going to be in, like, if you want to pay like the Lucid,
right,
starting price is $164,000. If you're in that market, that's who's going to have the lithium metal anode at the end of this decade. And then commercial for us riffraff, that'll be later on in the 2030s. So it's cool, but it's coming later, and solid state gets overblown. I think silicon, I'm following silicon. Again, it gets hyped, but it really stands to improve the range and to reduce costs. And costs, as you know, that's the main thing. We need a $25,000 EV.
Right.
But we're not going to, right? We're not going to, the average EV is now 40. Well, before these price increases, $43,000 is the average EV, and we already said the Model Y is $64,000. This does not hit the mainstream.
Yeah.
Right? We need, if you're
the
talking,
average ICE is more like 30-ish, 30, 31. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you need
internal combustion engine.
down. Yeah,
that's true. I think we have time for just one more, Steve, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We've had a few questions, kind of similar to the last one, but from the other side, talking about alternative metals sources. One of the great shibboleths, I think, of the commodities business, when people talk about rare earths, for example, or lithium being rare. None of these metals are actually rare. It's just a question of how much do you want to spend to extract them from whatever source they're currently buried in. But clearly, in a world where these are becoming more valuable, in a world where certain sources of supply are going to be difficult to tap or simply untappable. Are there obvious areas of the world where more could be developed?
Yes.
Care
Okay.
to elaborate?
Okay, are we done? Okay, no, sorry.
Care to elaborate on that?
So there it's very much like oil, so plenty of supply out there that's both proven and not proven of all of the metals that are currently discussed. But when you get to the big, to the larger scale, so not this decade, but when you're producing, right? So you said it right. The current annual demand for vehicles, 84 million vehicles. That's a lot of EVs. That's a lot of all of these metals. And so it makes you understand that there does need to be a turn to which are the metals that are the most ample. How do we deal with the batteries that are moving from a new vehicle to the next vehicle? What do we do with that? What do we do with that battery? And that's this whole idea of the closed loop. Some people, there's a writer, Mark Mills, who wrote a piece about a month ago, where he looked at the demand, projected demand for EVs, and then averaged out how much of the metals goes into each one, and is talking about the Earth. You're going to chew up the whole Earth, and to equip those batteries, and it's a good piece. It's definitely worth looking up. So there are a lot of metals out there. Everyone is going to have to think hard and strategically about which ones are used, which ones do we rely on, and a shift to, for the main part, for mainstream vehicles, to the most ample metals. This is something we're going to have to do.
Yeah, and by ample, you're talking really about LFP technologies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, iron and sodium.
Yeah.
As it is now, we're not, so for as much as we talk about next generation batteries, this is really, it's a slow moving field. It's not like transistors, right? It doesn't have a Moore's law. And so pretty much the technologies you're seeing right now, lithium ion with NMC or LFP, and a graphite anode with a little bit of silicon, that's the cheeseburger, right? People still eat cheeseburgers, and probably next decade they will too. And they also will be using lithium ion NMC or LFP and graphite with a little bit of silicon.
Great. Well, that brings us up to 1:15. Steve,
yes.
Thank you so much for sparing all this time and taking us through this. I hope everyone found this as fascinating and informative a discussion as I did. I'd just like to thank Steve for coming and talking to all of us. I'd like to thank Larry and Colette for hosting us, and MIT Sloan. And most of all, thank you for allowing me to talk at you for an hour or so. Goodbye, everyone.
Before we hop, Liam, thank you very, very much. And Steve, thank you. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And in an hour, even an hour and 15 minutes, of course, we can't cover all the topics. We barely touched on climate. And one of the issues climate-wise is, can we buy our way out of the climate problem with EV? Or is this going to grow too slowly? And I think Steve, in the very last minute, or Liam, suggested, well, maybe not. So that's a huge issue to come. In the chat box, there was a question about 15 minutes. Will Americans and Europeans and people wait 15 minutes for their so-called tank up for a charge? And even if they will, what will the lines be like? Will they be around the block? I don't look for an answer right now because I know Liam and Steve have places to go, but I do want to mention that Liam can be found at the Wall Street Journal. He is—
Sorry, Bloomberg, actually, Larry.
Excuse me, pardon me.
Used to be the Wall Street Journal.
Yes, at Bloomberg. And Steve has many different platforms. In the registration material, if you return to those, you can find links to both Liam's and Steve's books, articles, and look for them online as well. Steve, Liam, thank you so much. And Colette, thank you for being our technical host. Audience, thank you and goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks.